Welcome to Inside Asia. Today we will continue our dialogue with Dr. Michael Green on strategic matters related to Asia. And of course, Dr. Michael Green is a prolific writer and historian of American strategic matters. Dr. Michael Green, you have commented widely on the regional architecture in East Asia. Can you make a strong argument that what is happening now in Asia is what you perceive of?
It's what I expected. The word architecture is misleading because with architecture you have a master plan and people are very efficient, and usually one lead designer can draw that architecture. Multilateral cooperation in Asia looks much more like a garden that's not tended well, with lots of plants growing and very confusing, lots of color, lots of blooming flowers, lots of
I hope you are not referring to too many parasites.
Not too many parasites, hopefully. Scholars are growing tired of comparing Asia with Europe, but it's still worth doing. You know, Europe is democratic from Portugal to Poland. Europe has a development level, economic development level, that even though the difference between Portugal and Germany is large, it's not as big as the difference between, say, Myanmar and Japan. So the economic development level is hugely different in China. Political regime type, very, very different. And the Cold War is not over in Asia. In Southeast Asia, it may be, mostly, but in Northeast Asia you have a divided Korean Peninsula.
Correct.
And you have division across the Taiwan Strait. And Europe was able to create a whole community after the unification of Germany. It's very difficult for Asian governments to talk about what a future Asian regional order would look like, because they have to make a judgment about unified Korean Peninsula and unified China. Unified how? Democratic? China doesn't want to talk about a future order based on that kind of unification. So everyone knows that the residual Cold War divisions should end someday, but nobody wants to talk about how. So for all these reasons, it's very hard to have a clean, cohesive, rational architecture in Asia of multilateral institutions. And so the multilateralism of Asia reflects the diversity and the dynamism of the region. You have incredible inefficiencies. Why do we have an APEC and an East Asia Summit?
Overlapping.
And an ARF, and a Shangri-La dialogue, and an MMD? Why do we have all this? The reason is not because we need quantity. There's now enough. In terms of multilateral institution building, there's enough quantity. What we lack is quality.
Results.
We know the results. So discussion and dialogue is good. Winston Churchill said, you know, jaw, meaning talking, is better than war. There is a socialization process. It imposes a cost on a big country to move unilaterally.
Correct.
If the U.S. does too much unilateral, like we did in the 1997-98 fiscal crisis, we pay a price. Chiang Mai Initiative is born. China, Japan, other countries get influence at our expense. If China pushes too hard, it pays a cost. After this last year with Senkaku's, Shonan, and so forth, U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral security cooperation.
Yes.
U.S., Japan, Australia, it's growing tighter. So in this very fluid multilateral environment, when a country, a big country especially, acts too unilaterally, it pays a price. And so there's some stabilizing effect, and it socializes. But it is not a rational process. And it won't be until we have political regime types, threat perception that is more in common than it is now. I think that the form follows the reality. Reality can't create the form of multilateralism.
So you draw in Europe in your comparison. I have to mention then whether it's possible that Asia in the future will develop into a kind like Helsinki framework in 1975 that has such a positive implication toward Europe.
Yeah, Helsinki was positive. At the time, people thought Helsinki was critical to détente, that Helsinki was a betrayal of Western or universal norms and ideals because we were agreeing to some form of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. But Helsinki actually contained some of the ingredients of the collapse of communism because it highlighted human rights and gave the West a vehicle to focus on and support people on the other side of the Iron Curtain seeking freedom. So can we do that in Asia? I had some hope that perhaps the ASEAN Human Rights Charter could do something like Helsinki, create pressure on governments to protect its people, and hope for the oppressed to know that the world and the region are watching. Perhaps some kind of Helsinki agreement is possible in Asia.
Your point are very well taken because ASEAN is becoming a community. Mm-hmm. When you have people becoming a community, there will be more conflict on people to people. And you need a mechanism to settle whatever dispute at the national level or at the district level, you know. So I think your points were very well taken.
Now, one of the advantages of ASEAN being at the center of regional architecture, people say in the driver's seat, you know, driving. The advantage is ASEAN can socialize China, US, Japan, Korea, big powers, and get them to behave. You know, America, Japan, China, we all feel more comfortable if ASEAN is in the driver's seat. The downside, there are two downsides to ASEAN being in the driver's seat. Two weaknesses ASEAN brings to regional architecture. One is the ASEAN way. The ASEAN consensus building process. It's too slow, too boring, not efficient, no results. China
Prevent war. ASEAN leader will argue that it prevents war.
prevents war in ASEAN,
In ASEAN.
but it is not sufficient to prevent conflict in
Correct.
Northeast Asia among the major powers. And the ARF is a good example. People in Tokyo, Beijing, Washington, and Seoul do not take the ARF so seriously. They go, Clinton goes, you know, Japanese, Korean, Chinese foreign ministers go because they can have other meetings there.
That's right.
It's a convention.
Yeah.
It's a reunion. But ASEAN Regional Forum itself, it's too slow, it's too consensus oriented, so that's a downside to ASEAN centrality. The other downside is ASEAN is not coherent or cohesive. Over the last 5 years, what has happened is that Beijing has found that it can reach inside Cambodia or Laos, sometimes Burma, and it can affect internal deliberations
I see, yeah.
in ASEAN, in senior officials meetings. So the US or Japan or Australia or Korea, they are now realizing we have to go into our friends and allies. So ASEAN, instead of being a kind of a buttress against great power competition, instead of being a kind of an integrator of regional architecture, ASEAN is becoming a conduit for great power rivalry and competition.
This is something new. In the past,
This is the past 5 years.
Dr. Surin Pitsuwan used to describe ASEAN as a fulcrum for major powers to engage. Now
ASEAN can be a
it's become
fulcrum,
A fulcrum.
but it can also be an anvil that the major powers hit with their hammers.
That's correct. I think.
And I think that ASEAN is dangerously moving in that direction. And unless there is greater efficiency within the decision-making process in ASEAN, then it will be like a copper wire. It will be a conduit for the electricity and the power of a China or a Japan or an Australia or Russia or US trying to influence the outcome.
Then it could create tension.
It could increase tension. And this is new. This was the past 4 or 5 years.
EAS in the making.
EAS is a perfect example.
Yes.
In 2004, the senior officials of ASEAN had a meeting. Cambodia proposed and Laos proposed that it be held, and Malaysia supported them, it be held in China
Yes.
the second year.
Yes.
Singapore, Indonesia,
Yes.
Thailand were shocked. Some of them came to Australia, India, New Zealand and brought them in. And all the big powers were brought in to maintain balance. But the reason it happened in the first place was because ASEAN's decision-making process was too easily influenced by great power rivalry. Now, how does ASEAN fix that? Part of the answer is to strengthen political institutions within ASEAN member states. That's one. Number two is strengthen the Secretariat. Strengthen the role of ASEAN. The US has a very convergent interest with ASEAN's connectivity philosophy and a stronger ASEAN Secretariat. Because if it's a stronger Secretariat and a stronger connectivity and working towards stronger political institutions within member states, it will be harder for other big powers to interfere.
Well, you mentioned Secretary General and the Secretariat. Within ASEAN Insider, we said that Dr. Surin is neither Secretary nor General.
Right.
So he just, so he
He's
wants
a very,
to,
very clever man, though.
yeah, but he wants actually.
His
he
son
has
was
done-
my student.
Yeah, he has done a good job.
done a good job.
But he needs more mandate. He needs
Yeah.
expand roles to do what he can do best.
Yeah.
Raising profile of ASEAN.
Yes, and raising profile of ASEAN and showing that ASEAN can police its own affairs better,
Correct.
and showing that ASEAN has a vision that involves, that moves beyond non-interference. When ASEAN was created, the principle of non-interference in internal affairs was critical because many of these were post-colonial states with
Correct.
arbitrary borders,
Yes.
with ethnic
Malaysia,
mishmash.
Philippines, and all
Mishmash.
that. Yes.
It could easily have been a war. And non-interference was critical. And America's foreign policy for the first 50 or 100 years emphasized non-interference in internal affairs.
Also,
Why? Because we were a post-colonial state. Countries that have been colonies are very insecure about interference. But I think the U.S. has moved beyond that 60, 70 years ago. But I think it's time for ASEAN to begin moving beyond that and doing more to ensure that its member states are strong. And that means their institutions are strong and that they're accountable. And that's hard work. And Surin Pitsuwan, I know, understands this. But he doesn't have the mandate. He has to build this one step at a time through diplomacy, which he does. He's a very good diplomat. And he's very well respected abroad, which is good for ASEAN.
how do you see the role of Australia? Oftentimes in this region, we like to say Australia is a deputy sheriff of the U.S. You think that is true?
Australians hate that. Americans don't mind, but Australians hate that, and it's not a fair or accurate characterization. I mean, the one thing you can say about Australia and America is that we have always been there to support each other since the First World War. The first time Americans served under foreign generals abroad was in Europe, under Australian General Monash. We were comfortable having Australian generals. We were the deputies. Australia was the sheriff when we first went to war on the same side in the First World War. And we have been in almost every conflict together. And when you share blood and share risk like that, it creates inseparable level of trust. So we have with Australia a very, very unique and special relationship that in some ways goes beyond what we have even with Britain.
Oh, really?
Yeah, our relationship with Britain is much more complicated because the British were our masters. And somewhere down below, they still remember that. With Australia, we're both former colonies, and we have a depth of trust. There's anti-Americanism in Australia.
Yeah.
There's no anti-Australianism in America. Americans love Australia.
Yeah, even Australians critiques, blame FTA for the loss of jobs in Australia.
Sure.
Unbelievable.
But I think that Australia is viewed in Washington as indispensable. If we don't have Australia, if we ever go into a war or a conflict or some economic situation, if we don't have Australia, frankly, it's difficult for an American president to tell the American people it's a good idea. Why? Because Australia has been such a consistent friend. So that gives the Australians huge influence to tell us what to do. So they have a lot of influence on American policy. Australian intellectuals don't believe this. A lot of them think, the Howard government or the Rudd government do whatever Washington wants. It's not that simple. The Australians come in and tell us what to do. On regional architecture in 2001, the Australian Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, came in to see Secretary of State Powell, National Security Advisor Condi Rice, my boss, and said, you guys, US, you have got to get more serious about regional architecture. You've got to get more consistent about APEC. You have to look at the Treaty of Amity and cooperation with these. They told us, they gave us our orders. So it's a two-way flow. Also, the idea that because a country has very close relations with the US, it cannot have close relations with Asia is silly. It makes no sense.